Yo, what is going on, everyone? My name is Lepri of Stokastic.com, and in today's video, we're going to be going in depth into my top 8 quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends in terms of optimal percentage for week number 12 of the 2022 fantasy football season over on FanDuel. But before we could get into things, I would like to ask, if you are new to the channel and you do end up enjoying today's video, please make sure you hit that subscribe button down below. Whether you are new to the channel or not, make sure you leave a like on today's video, and we are going to be talking about our sponsor of today's video, BetMGM, a little bit later. So without further ado, let's get into my week number 12 FanDuel Contenders. We begin at number 8 with Tom Brady of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers going up against the Cleveland Browns this week in Cleveland, 7,400. Kyle Murray of the Cardinals going up against the Chargers at home in Arizona, 7,800. At 6, we have Justin Herbert of the Chargers going up against the Cardinals in Arizona, 7,900. And the real breakdown begins here at number 5 with Lamar Jackson of the Ravens going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars in Jacksonville, 8,200. Currently projected over on Stokastic for 20.6 fantasy points. The team, the Ravens, is 9th in implied point total on the week with 23.5. They're favored by 3.5 points, and Lamar has a 7.2 optimal percentage with a 6 boom percentage. Now, the Jacksonville Jaguars has been incredibly hit or miss defensively as well as offensively this season. We've seen some games where the Jaguars defense looks legitimately ferocious, and it looks like they hop back in the time machine to becoming the Saxonville Jaguars all those years ago. And then there's other games where, they look like the Jaguars and their defense folds like a table that the Bills fans jump through. So ultimately, Lamar Jackson should be in for a pretty solid spot here. He did not play all that great up against the Panthers last week in a stalemate of a game, an incredibly low-scoring game. I think this week, Lamar hops back on the saddle and has a much better performance. But honestly, ever since the beginning of the season, Lamar Jackson's fantasy value has at least not been top value. Next up, we move to number 4, Tua Tagovailoa of the Miami Dolphins going up against the Houston Texans at home in Miami, 8,300 on the week for Tua, projected for 22.5 fantasy points on Stokastic. The team is 2nd in implied point total with 30.5, favored by 14 points, 7.8 optimal percentage with a 10.3 boom percentage. The Houston Texans defense is one of the worst defenses in all of the National Football League, if not the worst defense in the NFL. Tua should have no struggle picking this defense apart. The only worry is that the Houston Texans defense is so bad, and they pivoted from Davis Mills to Kyle Allen, that once they get halfway into the game, if Tua's thrown 2 touchdowns and they're up 21-0, Jeff Wilson has a touchdown, then maybe in the second half, they just come out and just run the ball and roll all over the Houston Texans by running the ball, and that would obviously hurt Tua's chances at becoming the number 1 quarterback. Now, obviously, is that guaranteed to happen? Of course not. Maybe the Houston Texans wake up, they have a high-scoring, close game. Obviously, the Dolphins are favored by 14 points, so the books expect the Dolphins to kick the shit out of the Texans, but I am slightly worried about the fact that this might be a run-heavy game late, hurting Tua's upside. At number 3, we have Geno Smith of the Seattle Seahawks going up against the Las Vegas Raiders at home in Seattle, 7,600 on FanDuel, currently projected for 20.4 FanDuel points. Team is 7th in implied point total, 25.75 on the week, tied with the LA Chargers, 4-point favorites in this matchup up against a bad Raiders team, 8.5 optimal percentage and a 7.6 boom percentage. I actually think if the Raiders offense wakes up and doesn't play like absolute dog shit like we've seen at points in this season, this really could be a higher scoring affair between Geno and the Raiders. I like Geno a ton. He's been one of the most underrated quarterbacks all year. His price tag at 7,600 is incredibly juicy. That's why I like him a ton this week, as well as why our projections like him to have an 8.5 optimal percentage. At number 2, we have Kermit the Frog himself, Patrick Mahomes, the Kansas City Chiefs, going up against the LA Rams at home in Kansas City. Not surprisingly, Mahomes the most expensive quarterback on this slate at $9,000, projected for 23.6 fantasy points, 11.3 optimal percentage, 10.2 boom percentage. The only bigger favorite than the Dolphins this week is the Kansas City Chiefs, favored by 15.5 points in this spot, and the team is 3rd in implied point total with 28.75. And again, Mahomes is projected for 23.6 fantasy points in this spot. Now, the matchup's amazing. The Rams defense has not been what we thought the Rams defense would be like going into the season. The issue is the price point. When you jam in a quarterback worth $9,000 and his top stack option to stack with him is Travis Kelce, who's also roughly $7 zillion, we're going to be talking about a little bit later, it makes things tough. But then again, Patrick Mahomes is so good, and they do have some other cheap wide receivers that it makes him incredibly enticing. At number 1, we have the guy who lost to Patrick Mahomes in one of the Super Bowls, Jimmy Garoppolo, Jimmy G-Spot, quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers, going up against the New Orleans Saints at home in San Francisco, 6,800, currently projected for 17.6 fantasy points. Team is 6th in implied point total on the week with 26.25, favored by 9.5 points with a 14 optimal percentage and a 8.9 boom percentage. Jimmy Garoppolo blew the back out of the Arizona Cardinals in Mexico City last week in prime time. That was probably the best game I've seen out of Jimmy Garoppolo in a while. He dissected that defense up like they were a frog. The Saints defense is pretty average. I wouldn't say they're amazing. I wouldn't say they're just a shit defense that Jimmy Garoppolo is going to take a deuce on easily. But I do think if Andy Dalton is able to play like he played last week against the Rams, then maybe this could be a higher scoring game where Jimmy Garoppolo is able to pay off big on FanDuel. Now we move to the running back position, beginning at number 8 with Kenneth Walker III of the Seattle Seahawks going up against the Raiders in Seattle, 8,400. Josh Jacobs of the Raiders going up against the Seahawks in Seattle, 8,700. Travis Etienne of the Jaguars going up against the Baltimore Ravens at home in Jacksonville, 8,000. At 5, we have Austin Eckler of the LA Chargers going up against the Arizona Cardinals in Arizona, 8,800. Austin Eckler has been incredibly consistent thus far this season, outside of this start of the season where he came out incredibly slow. And I don't even think that's like the best way to describe it, because if you drafted him in your regular fantasy football league, then you were starting to panic pretty heavily, but obviously he bounced back, and this week he gets an Arizona Cardinals defense that, again, just got a train ran on him by Jimmy G and the San Francisco 49ers. We have Eckler projected for 17.3 fantasy points. The team is 7th in implied point total with 25.75. They are 3-point favorites, 14.5 optimal percentage for Eckler, 13.1 boom percentage. Without Mike Williams on the team, I do think you can make a good argument that Austin Eckler will be used even more. The bring back of Keenan Allen is also important as well, as I think that does somewhat reduce the targets of Austin Eckler, but ultimately, at this point in the season, he is the focal point of this offense. Obviously, outside of Justin Herbert, Austin Eckler is incredibly involved both in the pass-catching game as well as the rushing game. And again, the Cardinals defense is not good, so this should be a big spot for Eckler. At number 4, we have Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans, the Les Titans, versus the Cincinnati Bengals, 9,500. Cha-ching! That's a little high. Projected for 18.9 fantasy points. Team is 19th in implied point total, 20.25. 3-point dogs, 15.4 optimal percentage, 12.5 boom percentage. Now, obviously, any given week, Derrick Henry could put the Tennessee Titans basically in his metaphorical backpack and take them all the way to beat the shit out of any team in the NFL. The problem I have with Henry is 9,500. At that point, I would probably just rather play Austin Eckler. Don't think I'm going to have much Derrick Henry on FanDuel. Again, the price is just way too high at 9,500 for my liking. If you like him, that's okay. He's a great running back. He could easily pay off on the slate. That's why he's ranked number 4 in optimal percentage. At number 3, we have Christian McCaffrey of the Niners going up against the New Orleans Saints at home in San Francisco, 9,200. Projected for 18.6 fantasy points. Team is 6th in implied point total with 26.25. They're favored by 9.5 points. 16.8 optimal percentage for McCaffrey, 14.6 boom percentage. But before we break down McCaffrey a little bit more, I would like to give you guys a quick word for our friends, our sponsor over at BetMGM. If you click on the link down below in the video description, are a brand new user to BetMGM and bet $10 on any World Cup pregame money line, you will win $200 in free bets, guaranteed, as long as someone scores in the World Cup, which is guaranteed to happen, because even if there's no goal in the game you bet on, you're still going to get your $200 in free bets because someone is going to score in the World Cup. So I'm going to throw it onto your screen right now. You're going to navigate to the top of the screen after you sign up, click on soccer with a little soccer ball next to it, scroll on down and just bet on the biggest favorite. Whoever the biggest favorite is or whatever team you like the most, bet on them. And whether your bet wins or not, your team could get absolutely destroyed and you will still get $200 in free bets because someone's going to score a goal during the World Cup. So make sure you guys take advantage of this right now before it's too late, because this offer won't be here forever. Back on into Christian McCaffrey. Again, I like McCaffrey a ton this week. Didn't really do an amazing job last week. Like, he wasn't this upper echelon running back. Obviously had a pretty solid day up against the Arizona Cardinals. I think this week up against the Saints, we should see yet another pretty solid performance. McCaffrey is incredibly reliable every single week, and I think this game could be a big boom for him, especially, again, if the Saints are able to keep up. 14.6 boom percentage, the highest boom percentage of any running back we'll talk about in today's video. At number 2, we have James Conner of the Cardinals going up against the LA Chargers at home in Arizona, 7,000, projected for 13.9 fantasy points, 19.5 optimal percentage, 9.3 boom percentage. So James Conner is one of those running backs that started off the year just as a disaster. It was like Austin Eckler, but to the nth degree, because this motherfucker didn't really do anything until he came back from being hurt a couple of weeks ago. I think the fact that DeAndre Hopkins is back has really opened the door for this offense. I think with Kyler Murray returning this week up against the Chargers, we could be in for an incredibly solid matchup where James Conner potentially finds the end zone multiple times. At number 1, numero uno, we have Antonio Gibson of the Washington Commanders going up against the Atlanta Falcons at home in Washington, $6,100 on FanDuel, projected for 12.4 fantasy points, 13th in implied point total with 22.5, tied with the Detroit Lions, who played on Thanksgiving. 4-point favorites, 23.5 optimal percentage, 7.5 boom percentage. Now, Brian Robinson does obviously do something in this offense, right? It's not like Brian Robinson has completely disappeared. He's not like fucking John Cena. You can't see him. He's still going to be there. Still going to get touches, but Gibson's the pass catching back, and Gibson has looked like the much better back as of recently. He really turned things around after a poor start to the season, and up against a mouth-watering matchup of the Atlanta Falcons, there's a lot of reasons why Gibson's our number 1 most optimal running back on the week. Now we pivot to the wide receiver position, beginning at number 8 with Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, 7,500. Devontae Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders going up against the Seattle Seahawks in Seattle, 9,000. Chris Godwin of the Bucks going up against the Cleveland Browns in Cleveland, 7,000. And the true breakdown begins with Jerry Jeudy of the Broncos going up against the Carolina Panthers in Carolina, $6,000. Jerry Jeudy's availability is still very much up in the air as I'm recording today's video, so if he does not end up getting the nod to go, Mike Evans would have been the number 8 guy, and then you can just move everyone up while taking Jerry Jeudy out. So Jerry Jeudy's going up against the Carolina Panthers in Carolina, 6,000. I honestly do not like this spot much for him at all. The Panthers defense just really locked up all of the Baltimore Ravens passing attack last week. Now, maybe that was just a bad game out of the Ravens, but we all know the Denver Broncos offense is incredibly bad. So I think this is a bad spot for Jeudy, projected for 10 fantasy points, 13.9 optimal percentage, 4.5 boom percentage, 1.5 point dogs. Team is 24th in implied point total. So I don't necessarily think that Jeudy is the worst play, but he's probably a guy I would stay away from, even if he's good to go. At number 4, we have Keenan Allen of the LA Chargers going up against the Arizona Cardinals in Arizona, 7,300, currently projected for 12.4 fantasy points. The team is 7th in implied point total with 25.75, tied with the Seattle Seahawks, favored by 3 points, 13.9 optimal percentage with a 7.4 boom percentage. Like I talked about a little bit earlier, the comeback of Keenan Allen was relatively impressive last week. I thought he looked really good. Like, that was the most healthy to me he's looked all year. He hasn't played in very many games, but he did look pretty healthy. He gets the Cardinals this week. Again, this could be a really high-scoring tit for tat matchup. Allen is the number 1 receiver on this team without Mike Williams. Seems like a really solid spot for him, especially at just 7,300, which is kind of high, but if I'm being honest with you, I do have a lot of trust in Keenan Allen. At number 3, we have Garrett Wilson of the Jets going up against the Bears at home in MetLife, 6,000, projected for 11.1 fantasy points, 16th in implied point total with 22, 5.5 point dogs, 18.1 optimal percentage, 6.6 boom percentage. So when it comes to Garrett Wilson, obviously the biggest question mark is Mike White. Will Mike White be able to steer the ship in the correct direction for Garrett Wilson to be an absolute fucking smash in this matchup? Now, anything has to be better than Zach Wilson, who absolutely took a dump on the chest of your fantasy football teams, or basically on anything you had that involved the Jets, were absolutely screwed by Zach Wilson. They could not move the ball, so it can't be much worse. This is a very positive matchup up against the Bears, and Mike White looked pretty decent last year. I'm not sure if he's going to come out with that same pizzazz, that same spark, but I think Garrett Wilson is interesting. At number 2, we have Deebo Samuel of the 49ers going up against the New Orleans Saints at home in San Francisco, 6,900. Very nice. Projected for 12.9 fantasy points. Team is 6th in implied point total with 26.25. Favored by 9.5 points, 18.6 optimal percentage, 9.2 boom percentage. So when it comes to Deebo Samuel, he's been relatively cold all season long, aside from his 2 primetime matchups where he ate the Ravens alive, and he also, or not the Ravens, the Rams alive. He also had a really big game last week up against the Cardinals. Mr. Primetime Debo, this game isn't in primetime. He's like the reverse Kirk Cousins. I don't hate this spot against the Saints, but I am always kind of cautious with Debo because his numbers have really dipped compared to last year because he's not scoring touchdowns. But hey, maybe now he's on a roll. He's going to start steaming, and he's going to end up being a guy that helps you take down a big prize pool this week. At number 1, we have Tyreek the Freak Hill of the Dolphins going up against the Houston Texans at home in Miami. $9,200 practice for 18 or projected for 18.8 fantasy points. Team is second in implied point total with 30.5. Again, they're favored by 14 points, 22.3 optimal percentage, 23.3 boom percentage. Now, I know Tyreek Hill is a huge payout, but Tyreek Hill is one of the few wide receivers in the NFL that could literally catch the ball 3 times, have 140 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Tyreek Hill is incredibly impressive. The Texans defense is straight ass cheeks. Now, again, obviously we talked about this with Tua. There is a chance that the Dolphins just let up on the gas. They stop firing at all cylinders, but that's a risk you're going to have to take because there's also a chance that they go full onto the gas and just start pounding on the Texans, and Tyreek could have a humongous performance. I am personally going to be on a lot of Dolphin stacks this week. Next up, we move to the tight end position, the final position of today's video. At 8, we have Noah Fant of the Seattle Seahawks going up against the Raiders, 5,100. Foster Moreau, the Raiders going up against Seattle, 5,400. Tyler Conklin of the Jets going up to Chicago, 4,800. And then we begin with Hayden Hurst of the Bengals going up against the Atlanta Titans in Tennessee, 5,100. Projected for 6.6 fantasy points, 10th in implied point total, 23.25. 3-point favorite, 7.5 optimal percentage, 2.7 boom percentage. So when it comes to Hayden Hurst, he is pretty interesting because they may or may not have Jamar Chase this week. And if they have Jamar Chase, then I'm not all out on Hayden Hurst, but at 5,100, when there's other options, I feel like I wouldn't be super likely to play him. Again, I'm not sure if Jamar is going to come out there, be 100%, be kind of like a decoy, but it would be enough to scare me away from him. I don't necessarily think he would be awful with Chase out there, but his upside is definitely limited by a receiver with the skill set of Jamar Chase. Hayden Hurst projected for 6.6 fantasy points, 10th in implied point total, 3-point favorite, 7.5 optimal percentage, 2.7 boom percentage for Hurst. At 4, we move to Greg Dulcich of the Denver Broncos going up against the Carolina Panthers in Carolina, 5,300. Projected for 6.7 fantasy points, 24th in implied point total with 18.75. 1.5 point dogs, 9.3 optimal percentage, 2.9 boom percentage. Obviously, hitching the wagon to any piece of this Denver Broncos offense is going to be gut-wrenching anytime you go ahead and do it. The Panthers defense did look incredibly legitimate up against the Ravens. If Jerry Jeudy does not play, my optimism for Greg Dulcich is even higher. Right now, again, that is up in the air. I still do think that Greg Dulcich is a fine play if Jeudy does get the nod to go, though. He hasn't been the best over the last 2 games, but we've seen that upside, and Russell Wilson's good to score maybe 2 touchdowns here, and if one of them goes to Greg Dulcich, you'll be pretty happy. And number 3, we have, and saying he's good for 2 touchdowns might be a bit of a stretch. At number 3, we have George Kittle of the 49ers going up against the Saints at home in San Francisco, 6,200, projected for 8.9 fantasy points. Again, the team is 6th in implied point total, favored by 9.5 points, 9.7 optimal percentage, 5.7 boom percentage. It's pretty easy to see that we like the 49ers on FanDuel this week. We like Debo, we like Kittle, we like Jimmy Guap, and we like Christian McCaffrey. Let's hope that you can pick the correct ones. Kittle, pretty off when he started this year, but recently he's been on fire. At number 2, we have Mock Andrews of the Ravens going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars in Jacksonville. I talked about this in the DraftKings video. I am someone who's going to be paying the big bucks at the tight end position this week. Mark Andrews of the Ravens going up against Jacksonville again in Jacksonville, 7,300, projected for 13.1 fantasy points. Team is 9th in implied point total with 23.5, 3.5 point favorite, 17.9 optimal percentage, 8.2 boom percentage. Andrews hasn't really been the best as of recently, but in reality, we know in the NFL, there's like 3 tight ends that can get 3 touchdowns at any given game. That's Kittle, Andrews, and Kelsey. Thus, why when they're playing, I like to pay up to get them. And the final tight end here, Travis Kelce, 8,200 of the Chiefs going up against the Rams, projected for 15.2 fantasy points. Team is third in implied point total with 28.75, 15.5 point favorites, 20.2 optimal percentage, 23.5 boom percentage. There's a lot of injuries to the Chiefs wide receivers. It appears Juju will be able to play, but that is still up in the air. If Juju doesn't play, then I'm going to be banging the drum even harder for Travis Kelce. This is a really good spot up against the Rams defense. Thank you guys all so much for watching. If you did end up enjoying, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below, as well as hitting that like button. It would help me out a ton. If you want to follow me on Twitter, please do so at NotoriousFNTSY. Make sure you check out that exclusive bet with BetMGM. Bet $10, win $200 in free bets if anyone scores a goal in the World Cup. All you got to do is place a pregame moneyline bet of $10 on BetMGM on any World Cup game and win $200 in free bets if anyone scores in the World Cup, which is guaranteed to happen. Thank you guys for watching. Love you all. As always, good boy.